Hey guys, welcome back to the Roots and Dirt podcast. I'm Letta, if this is your first time here. In the next upcoming videos, you will be seeing things like the tomato varieties I'm growing this year, pepper varieties, all sorts of fun things like that. But I wanted to start off this season with a little bit of a recap of 2025's growing season and how that is impacting how I'm growing things this year in 2026. 2025's growing season started off pretty slow. We actually had a really nice start to the season weather wise when I was starting baby plants and doing all of the things that way. I could bring them outside earlier in the season. We had a very mild spring, but we had a very long spring, and that spring really lasted almost through mid June, I would say. We did start warming up, but our nights were not getting warmer. And the garden really didn't start to take off until the end of June. So while our garden season was nice and long, we had a later fall and we had a lot of those spring crops lasted way longer than they normally do out in the garden. We didn't really start to heat up for those solid summer crops until the end of June. We're going to fast forward just a month now to the second to last week of July, where I ended up injured. I dislocated my patella, which is your kneecap, and ripped up a bunch of the ligaments in my knee. This meant in the heart of the growing season, when things were going to start coming into process, when the garden was very much in heavy maintenance mode as far as harvesting and needing to prune and train up tomatoes and cucumbers and all of those things, I was completely unable to be in the garden at all. Now, I was very thankful at this point that I had done as much legwork prior to that as I had, to where the garden was pretty much weed free at the time, minus, maybe some grass growing in areas that we hadn't planted yet. But it was virtually weed free. I had specifically planted so that I only had 2-foot wide garden beds and I had 3-foot wide pathways between them, which sounds like a lot of pathway. But that allowed for more of the growing space to be taken up by plants. I also didn't need to reach as far into those beds in order to harvest or weed, which was much better on my lower back, as I am not 20 anymore. I am not elderly yet, but it is getting harder and it wears more on my body if I'm short, so I need to reach like my entire body length across almost a 4-foot wide bed, 4 to 5 foot wide bed. I'm only 5'2", so reaching up across those larger beds, really wears on my back over time. So this year I planted them 2 to 2.5 feet wide, which was so nice. I would highly recommend doing that. And I was so thankful that I had done that, even though I didn't know that that was going to be so important for me later down the road. So again, having that fabric mulch down in all of my pathways, so I didn't need to weed that. I had kept up on all of my weeding in my beds. Most things, at least all of the main crops, were all planted out and had been well cared for up until the point where I got hurt. I'd like to say that I really had a good head on my shoulders through this whole long, icky process last year, but the reality is that's just not the case. I probably spent the first 3 weeks mad and frustrated, and so grateful for friends and family that helped harvest things that absolutely had to get out of the garden for those plants to continue to produce. My husband and sons, they helped weed in there for that first little bit when I was still hoping I was going to maybe be able to get back into the garden. They were trying to maintain it so that I could come back to a garden that wasn't just total utter chaos and that was still productive. The reality is that even now in January, my knee is still recovering. I spent most of the garden season not able to do much of anything, with the goal of physical therapy to get me to the point where I could harvest my pumpkins at the end of the season, which I did. I was so thankful for that. I By the end of the season, I was able to sort of sneak around the garden and harvest tomatoes and other things. My sister came down and helped me process sauce and salsas. Um, Other people helped me with a handful of things here and there, but it did mean that I wasn't able to sell at the market for the entire rest of the season. I had a lot, because I plant for market, I had a lot of produce that went to waste, even though I had people come and glean and take what they could and bring me what they could, and I could put up as much as I could, which really wasn't much for this last year. It was just a very bummer garden season for me, but I learned some things in the process. I fully believe that when really awful, not fun things happen, and there have been worse things that have happened to me and my family through the years. So I wouldn't even say this is the worst of the things, right? But when things that are hard happen, you have two things that you can do. One, you can sit and mope and pout and whine about it and, just feel sorry for yourself, or you can find the good in it. And in that case, it meant I had a lot more time to study scripture. I had time to think about, okay, well, I've always been blessed to be able to work in my garden injury free. But what about the people that aren't that way? And what if my knee never gets back to the way it was? Or what if something like this were to happen again? How could I set myself up better for success next year, or help those out who are struggling with similar problems? Um, my injury meant I couldn't squat well for a really long time. It meant that I couldn't lift my leg very high either for a while. So wandering around a garden with debris or with vines or things like that, a lot of times I could not lift my leg. I couldn't get the second half of my leg up high enough to be able to not trip if I was walking over the top of things. Um, for the longest time, I couldn't walk through the garden at all. It just wasn't safe for me to do so. So I had to start flipping that around and going, okay, let's use this for good. Let's find ways to learn from this situation. I was blessed to spend a ton of time in my Bible and just spending extra time with friends and family in that time period. I read books for fun, which I haven't had time to do in ages. So a lot of great things came out of that. People were very gracious in that process. So what are some things that I'm changing for this next year? One of those is I'm going to continue to do my garden beds only 2 to 2.5 feet wide. One, that was fantastic anyway for my back. Two, it actually allowed for me to be able to sit down on the ground once I could get down to the ground. Sometimes I still needed someone to help me back up, but it allowed me to sit down and do a little bit of weeding, and still be able to just reach over a little farther to weed the middle. I didn't need to worry about getting across this big, wide bed. The same went for harvesting things. If there was something that needed to be harvested, I could do so just sitting there, and it was just right there at my fingertips. It allowed for easier access for weeding and things like that. All of those things were huge. Another thing that I would do in that situation, or if you're in a situation like I was, is that I would not grow much for indeterminate tomatoes. I would grow mostly determinate tomatoes. Now, I say this because I had maintained my tomato crop beautifully up until this injury, and it was okay for a week or so after that. But the problem is at the same time I got hurt was the same time those tomatoes needed to start being trellised up more, and I was not able to do that. And so those tomatoes just started growing out and growing out and growing out farther and farther and farther away from their support systems. making it very hard for me to get through the garden once I could start going through the garden. If they had been determinate tomatoes and were smaller plants where, they stay generally in the cage that you stick them in, that would not have been a problem. Once they start flopping and they start doing just whatever they want, your tomatoes are much more prone to just not being nice, usable tomatoes, right? They end up on the ground. They have a lot more pest pressure that way. There's just all sorts of things that aren't great about that. And you just feel kind of awful about yourself because now you have tomatoes all over and you just can't do anything about it. So I, this year, am planting mostly determinate tomatoes. I am planting, when you see the tomato video, a large handful of indeterminates that are my favorite tomatoes, that I just don't know that I wouldn't not be able to plant because I really do love them. However, I'm going to do a determinate trial of tomatoes of about 12 different varieties that I'm testing out that are determinants or semi-determinants, so that I can find those varieties that do very well in my garden or that I can recommend to other local growers that maybe are in need of something like that. You don't have the physical ability to maintain those larger tomato plants, or you just don't want to maintain those larger tomato plants, or you just prefer a determinate tomato. Whatever it might be, I'm going to be doing a determinate tomato trial this year. Another thing that I would do if I knew that I was going to be in this similar situation this next summer is I would focus on growing pole beans and not bush beans. Generally, I really enjoy a bush bean because especially for market, I have a much higher concentration of yield, so I can harvest a lot more at one time, meaning when I'm canning green beans, if I can green beans, of which we did find the best way to cook and can green beans is with some Worcestershire sauce, some soy sauce, lots of garlic, a little bit of onion powder. Oh, it is so delicious. Now we eat green beans all the time that are canned. So I would highly recommend doing that. However, if I knew I was going to be injured again, I would focus mostly on growing pole varieties because it was impossible for me to pick beans. I think I picked a handful of beans the entire season because they were ready right when I got hurt, or right after, and then I couldn't get down to harvest them. And so had I had pole beans, they would have been up higher. I would have been able to pick those. So that is something that I would focus on if I was growing beans and I knew that I had an injury like that, or if I was just limited in my mobility, I would plant pole beans. Another thing that I would do is I would grow in raised beds if I knew this was a permanent situation. I wouldn't grow in raised beds like a lot of people grow in, where they're only like maybe a foot off the ground. I would plant in at least a 2-foot high, possibly 3-foot high raised bed. And I say that for a few reasons. One, I never would have been able to harvest stuff even if it was in a 1-foot high bed because I couldn't get that low to the ground and I'm short. I also would say that because if you really are limited in your mobility, a 2-foot high, maybe 2.5-foot high bed, say you were in a wheelchair or something, would give you the ability to just, scoot your way right along it, and it would be at a height that you could reach things. If you grew determinate tomatoes instead of and indeterminate tomatoes in that situation, then you would still be able to reach those. Rather, an indeterminate on top of a raised bed now is almost too high for you to reach as well. In those raised bed situations, I would probably grow a bush bean because you wouldn't want a super long pole bean out of those situations, but a bush bean in a raised bed would actually be very beneficial to you. I would grow, and I already do this, but I would grow and I would focus on growing storage crops. I would focus on growing your potatoes but I would grow potatoes maybe in like a Ruth Stout method where you're not having to dig as far down into the soil. If you're limited in mobility, I would grow them where they're just a little bit into the soil, like barely into the soil, and then topped with a straw or something, where when it comes time to harvest, you can just simply pull that straw away and find your potatoes. I would focus on storage crops because they require less of my time in preservation and in harvesting and like just regular maintenance in general. One of the best things that happened was that I had focused on storage crops this last year. And so I had a lot of winter squash. I had carrots, I had beets, I had all kinds of things that could just kind of sit in the ground and wait for me, wait until either I had help to harvest those things or wait because they just simply weren't going to be ready yet. And so by the time I could harvest them, one, I could schedule in the help of somebody to come and help me harvest that because I didn't have to get it, right that second when it's ripe, like a tomato or a pepper or something like that. And I also didn't have to focus on preserving it immediately. I could harvest it. I could just rinse it off a little bit. I don't scrub those things usually. I just rinse like extra mud and dirt off of them some. And then I let them air dry a tiny bit and I bag them up and they go in my refrigerator. We have a fridge dedicated. I've talked about that, I think, in past videos where we just keep our garden produce in there and that gets us through the winter with fresh veg. So I would focus on those because one of the hardest parts of this whole process was I could go out once I started to feel a little better come like mid-September. I could go out and I could harvest things. But my knee would get too sore and I wouldn't be able to then come back and preserve those things. So I had to be very particular. I could go out and I could harvest just little bits of things at a time and do small little preserving projects. That's something I would recommend if you're in those same situations. Don't do large, huge harvests of anything at one time unless you have a lot of help to preserve it. Just harvest a little bit so that you can reserve that energy and your body's ability to preserve that when you get back home. The benefit to those storage crops was I didn't need to worry about that. I could go and I could harvest. I usually could schedule in somebody to help me, and then I could come back. I could keep them bagged even like they were for the time being and put them in the fridge as is, or if I felt like I was able, I could just rinse them off, bag them up right away into their storage bags, and put them in the fridge for storage. It was such a blessing to have that. So those are just a handful of small things. I would say the mental battle is the hardest battle. And if you can win that, if you can remember that God makes all things work for the good of those who love him, have been called according to his purpose, and trust that he will provide for you, you're going to do just fine. Those hard times, whatever it is, right? Like maybe it's just crop failures. Maybe it's something traumatic that happens in your life and you have to walk away from the garden. It's going to be fine. You can get through it. We got through it. I'm excited for the 2026 growing season. Our daughter got engaged in the midst of that, so we're wedding planning and doing all the great things that come along with that. I'm excited to start plants for people again this year. It's going to be a great season. And you know what? I'm hoping not, but if something were to happen again and we were going to end up in the same situation where we couldn't manage the garden the way we're hoping to manage the garden, we would deal with it, right? And we would take the lessons that we've learned this year and apply them. So hopefully that helps us out for this growing season. And we would do the same thing again if we needed to. So I just wanted to touch base on that and just remind you that if last year's garden season wasn't amazing, if it just turned into a complete hot mess, praise the Lord that there is a new year and that you can start fresh. I think that's my absolute favorite thing about gardening is that His mercy is new each year, and you get to start over. You get to take what you learned and you get to start over again. And, there just aren't that many things in life that are that way, are there? So I pray that you are getting excited for the upcoming growing season. Some of you are much closer than others to that time period, but I just trust that this video finds you well. And if it doesn't, I hope that you can find the good in the hard. God bless. Make it a great day.